Hello, friends. In this video, I'm going to talk about the moon in astrology, the last in the series of the 7 major planets, or grahas, as they're called in India. And the moon is simply the principle of growth and adaptation. It also symbolically governs the realm and experience of generation and dissolution, in the past also called generation and corruption. I find dissolution to be a more kind word than corruption. Corruption is a pretty macabre word, and I think the medieval people that were writing about this stuff tended to be kind of macabre about it. So, yeah, what does this mean? Well, Dane Rudyard called this principle of growth and adaptation, he called it intelligence. That basically, in his mind, intelligence was the ability to adapt oneself to the needs of a given situation, right? Rather than what we think it should be, which is more perhaps of a mercurial thing, or even sometimes a Saturnic thing, right? Where we're resistant. Saturn resists things. Saturn is, again, that part of us that maintains some sort of stability, some sort of consistency in who we are and how we express ourselves. And oftentimes that is Saturn's an impersonal influence. Saturn and Jupiter are sort of the planets that show how we were socially influenced, how we were, educated in terms of like right and wrong, according to our culture, according to our family, our heritage, right? Like the habits and patterns we picked up from our society and whatnot, and that we kind of identify with, right? Especially Saturn. Saturn is very much about identity. But the moon is the personal aspect of who we are, right? It's the most personal, intimate aspect of who we are. And so the moon is that part of ourself that allows the structural part to, right, bend but not break with the changing circumstances. If we just have Saturn, right, we have, traditionally Saturn is cold and dry. So with Saturn, we don't have any connection, right? Dry things don't connect with each other. Moist things connect. And the moon is cool or cold and moist. And so, with Saturn, we have basically no movement, right? With the moon, we start to get the connection and a little more movement because, again, it's cold, so it's not necessarily moving rapidly like the sun or Mars might be, which are hot and dry. But the thing about the moon is that it is moving, right? It moves very quickly astronomically. It has roughly 29, 30 sort of phases relative to the sun. And so it represents in that sense the changing, the flow of our thoughts, right? The changing stations of our mind, thoughts, emotions, heart, right? And this does allow us to adapt ourselves, for better or worse, to the demands of the environment we find ourselves in, especially on a daily basis, right? This is on a daily, intimate, personal kind of basis. It's not impersonal like Saturn, Jupiter, and even the sun, right? The sun just shines on all indiscriminately, but we were each born into a very particular lunar phase, which would already be changing just a day later, right? And the moon moves about 12, 13 degrees a day, which is significantly more than any other planet in astrology. Way more, right? The second fastest from that would be Mercury, which, I think it is max speed is maybe 1 degree in like 15 minutes or 20 minutes per day, something like that, right? Still significantly less. So the moon, like our thoughts and feelings, changes very rapidly, but it's cool, right? It's cool. It's not hot in terms of its basic, energetic principles. It's cold and moist. So it connects us, like I mentioned before, to other things, but it's cold, right? So we get attached. We tend to get attached to feelings and states of mind, maybe for about a day at a time. But the wild thing about the moon, right, is that if we consider dividing the zodiac signs by 12 each, which is something called 12 parts, it's a little bit more of an advanced technique, but I'm bringing it in to illustrate a point, right? Even within the span of a day, the moon is going to move through four, 5, and even possibly 6 different 12th parts. So even throughout the course of the day, right, we can have a very varied day mentally and emotionally, right? Even throughout the course of a day, all the people born on that day, they're going to have all the planets in basically the same positions except the moon, right? They might have the same moon sign, but they may not have the same moon 12th part, and so on. And of course, then the ascendant, will make the chart even more unique and individualized. But the ascendant's not a planet. Anyway, so the moon, it really, it literally governs the tides. It has an effect on the tides of the planet, right? Of the oceans and whatnot. It governs the menstrual cycles in women and so on. And so the moon really is representative of that aspect of reality on a cosmic level, right? I've talked about it a little bit more psychologically just now, but on a cosmic level, it is the principle of growth and dissolution, right? So as it's waxing, right, as it's moving away from the sun after the new moon, it is building up the forms of life, right? It is growing things. It is growing the flower. It is growing the tree. It is growing, the person from a baby into an adult, and so on. It is growing the fruits of a tree, let's say. And then during the waning phase, right, that's where or at the full moon phase, I should say, that's where the fruit ripens, right? It gets to its apex, it ripens, it's perfect. And then as the moon starts to wane, that's where the fruit falls, right? And starts to decay. And the seeds, this is very important, right? The seeds begin to spread, right? Animals eat them, insects get them, whatever, and carry them to different places, right? Animals eat them and then, walk to some other area and poop them out, right? So while the waxing phase is about like growth out of the seeds, the waning phase is in a sense about the release of seeds that will create a future cycle. So we have this natural, flow of yin and yang, of generation and dissolution, this cycle of creation and destruction, which inherently is also how things are preserved, right? So you have the classical trinity of all religions, and in the Indian pantheon, they came to be called the Trimurti, which was Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, right? Creation, preservation, and destruction, right? All cycling back into one another, or the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, or I should say rajas, which would be creative, right? Sattva, which would be preservative, and tamas, which would be destructive or inertia. And if you think about a seed, right, it's very tamasic in a sense because it's focalizing energies within itself and it's dormant, it's potential, pure potential. So that's kind of the basics of the moon, together with Saturn, especially if anybody follows Dane Rudyard's work, the moon and Saturn have a lot to do with the structure of the person's ego as a healthy psychological function, not as like a sort of like a selfishness. The ego being the ability, again, to maintain ourselves, Saturn, and adapt that form, that structure. So let me reload this. Excuse me. Okay. One moment. My internet's being a bit odd these days. See if this loads. Sorry about this, guys. Anyway, as this hopefully loads, please load. please pray. As this hopefully loads, we're going to see that the moon also has to do with the vital spirit. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to skip to this part down here, which is from the Sufi doctrine stuff that I keep talking about. And this is my website, as always. You can go check this out if you want to revisit it without the video. The vital spirit, called Ahru, by analogy with the transcendent spirit, is what Hindus call prana and alchemists spiritus. It is a subtle modality intermediate between the immortal soul and the mortal or physical body. It is the divine spirit as the circumference of a circle to its center. And I love this part. This just awakened so much in me. It's just like, okay, yeah, that's great. So the sun is like the center of the circle, and the moon is the circumference, right? So the moon deals with relationship, with consciousness, with relating the solar principle, which is unity, right, to a perceived otherness in that sense, right? It's the moon is to the sun, right, as multiplicity or differentiation is to unity. So the vital spirit is relatively undifferentiated, right? So it's undifferentiated like the sun, because it's receiving the sun's light. So it only appears differentiated, right? Our various mental states and feelings and the fact that we appear separate, these are appearances, these are fluctuations, these are like waves in an ocean, right? Still the one ocean, but it has these waves, right? So it appears to change and move and breathe. It includes not only the spatially delimited body, but also the sensory faculties with their spheres of experience. Again, what we're talking about, right? The moon, the changing mental states, all that stuff. So we can describe the moon as the sensory input mind in a sense. And this is called manas in Sanskrit in India. Manas, translated as mind, right? But really a specific kind of mind, not the mind of Mercury or the mind of Saturn, right? Or any of the other minds, right? It's specifically kind of this lower mind that makes sense of the changing tides of existence. Ordinarily, man is not aware of it, but in certain states of realization, the spirit becomes the vehicle for a diffused spiritual light, which may even radiate externally. So this principle of vitality, right, this prana, this is where we get into what might be called the etheric body in modern parlance, or the pranayama kosha in classical Indian parlance. It is the subtle energy body that is a blueprint for the physical body. So down to every cell, organ, and so on, these things exist as in this subtle energetic form and then crystallize, you could say, into their physical counterpoints, right? Which is why if you have an organ removed or a limb removed, it is actually still there energetically, but now the physical component or the ability for it to be physical is lost. And it's kind of an interesting thing. If you read about this, you'll find that a lot of amputees of limbs, right, have something called phantom limb syndrome, where they still feel their arm, like let's say they lost from their elbow up, they lost this whole area, they'll still feel this as though it's there. And oftentimes it'll be very painful because their mind can't make sense of it, right? So it's a very painful experience. And certain therapies can make it not painful, but to my knowledge, it still feels like it's there because energetically it actually is. The blueprint for it is still there. That blueprint is a lot harder to mutilate or destroy, though it is possible, of course. But it's a lot harder. It can happen with things like drugs and certain intensely emotionally abusive behaviors. But yeah, otherwise it's very difficult to destroy that. I think I've pretty much talked about everything else here. But I do want to say that, again, with regard to the sun, right, we can compare the moon to Saturn most fruitfully, but also to the sun most fruitfully, right? The moon takes that, the moon is like it's like the most direct vehicle for the sun, right? It's the most direct vehicle for our soul self, right? The divine intelligence, the nous of the sun, as I talked about in the sun video, becomes distributed and reflected and related in the moon principle, right? And then it's sort of Mercury who mediates between those two spheres in a sense. So That's really all the moon is. And this is why in classical texts you'll see that the moon has a lot to do with appetites, desires, comforts, right? Mental stability. If the moon is afflicted in a chart, it really harms the entire chart. It harms in the sense that if the mind is very unstable, then the good things promised by the chart can't really be focused and brought to fruition by in the life of the person, because we're only able to really live the life that we allow, right, with our thoughts and feelings and beliefs and so on. And so the moon is kind of, in a sense, it kind of represents all of the faculties of all the other planets, with maybe the exception of the sun, right? But all those other spiritual, psychological faculties I talked about in the other videos are they're all kind of encapsulated by the moon, and then we divide them out into like specifics of like Mars being conjecture and Venus being imagination. But the moon is also very imaginative, right? Very receptive, very psychic. Strong moons in charts make a person who's very psychic, very open to music and whatnot. And yes, the moon has a lot to do with bringing things into the world. It's sort of what connects you to the world. It's like your anchor, right? If we're like a ship here sailing, to use that nautical metaphor again, then the moon is kind of like the anchor, right? Or it's like the guiding star, or whatever you want to think of it as, right? It connects us to something in the world. If the mind can't find a connection to the world, a reason to be here, something to focus on, right, then serious problems ensue. This is where you get serious mental illness and drug abuse and escapism and suicide and early death and things like that. If not outright suicide, basically an early death because the person just doesn't care. So the moon is also much about how we nurture ourselves, how we feel emotionally safe, right? Of course, it represents our mother, but I think fundamentally it really represents what I started out with, growth and adaptation and whatnot. But in that sense, right, being the circumference of the circle, it is what allows us to connect to the physical world. So in contrast to the sun, which wants to be pure and purify everything and really has no concern for the superfluous nature of life, the moon, on the other hand, is almost only concerned with the superfluous nature of life, right? The moon wants to feel good, right? It doesn't really care how it feels good. Specific desires or specific things that are going to make us feel good, that's more Venus, right? That's a portion of the moon mind that becomes, specific. So, the moon just says, oh, I want to feel good. Give me things that'll feel good. So it gets ice cream and it drinks alcohol, it goes to parties or whatever. But then Venus goes, I really like this specific flavor of ice cream. I really like this specific distillation of vodka from this year, from this country, and so on, right? But the moon's not that specific. The moon just wants to feel good. It wants to feel connected, right? It's about it. It wants to have a good time. Now that doesn't always manifest as like, a bacchanalia of things, but the moon is very much about experiencing things, so when we read a chart and we look at the moon, this is why the whole chart can be read with the moon as an ascendant, and it works amazingly well. And sometimes I find it works better than reading from the actual ascendant. Okay. Because it's that important. It really is. And so I think, if I keep going on, this video is it's just never going to end. There's so much about the moon that's so important to observe. But you don't need to observe it intellectually, be like the moon and just let it come to you when you're reading the chart. Okay, guys, well, I hope this video has been helpful. Please hit like, share, and all that good stuff. Subscribe. Check out my website. Check out this whole series for more if you haven't seen the rest of the series. And have an awesome day. Oh, sorry. Okay, bye now.